It was a bright Saturday afternoon, the kind that made the town look almost peaceful. The streets were warm under the sun, and a few people moved slowly between small shops that lined Elm Street. The sound of laughter came from a group of kids sharing ice cream outside the corner store. Everything seemed normal until a sudden shout broke the calm. Across the street, a girl in a simple blue dress was walking home from the library. Her name was Aaliyah Johnson. She carried a small brown tote bag filled with books, her phone, and a few coins she had left from the week's allowance. Aaliyah was 17, quiet and thoughtful, the kind of girl who loved reading more than going to parties. She had no idea that in a few minutes her world was about to change in a way she could never forget. As she passed the convenience store, 2 police officers stepped out from their patrol car and called to her. At first, she didn't even realize they were talking to her. The taller officer raised his voice, telling her to stop. Confused, she turned, clutching her bag against her chest. "Yes, sir?" she asked politely. "Come over here, miss," the officer said, his voice sharp but not yet angry. "We just need to ask you a few questions." Aaliyah walked closer, wondering what this was about. Her heart began to beat faster. People nearby were watching now, curious. One of the officers held a small notepad and looked her over as if he were searching for something out of place. "We got a report," the shorter officer said, "that someone matching your description took something from this store." Aaliyah blinked, confused. "Took something? From this store?" "I didn't even go inside," she said. "Can you show us what's in your bag?" The taller officer asked. "Of course," she said, trying to stay calm. She unzipped her tote bag and showed them her books and phone. "That's everything. You can check." But the officers didn't seem satisfied. One of them exchanged a look with the other, the kind that says something doesn't add up. The shorter one stepped closer. "You sure you don't have anything else?" "We've got witnesses saying the suspect hid the item under her clothes." Aaliyah frowned. "I don't have anything under my clothes. I didn't do anything wrong." The taller officer sighed and said, "Miss, if you're not hiding anything, then you won't mind if we check, right?" By now a few more people had gathered around. Phones were out, recording. Someone whispered, "She's just a kid." Another person said, "Why don't they just call her parents?" Aaliyah's hands started to shake. She looked around for help but didn't see anyone she knew. Her heart raced. "Please, I didn't steal anything," she said softly. The officers didn't seem to hear her. The shorter one told her to stand still, and the taller officer started patting the sides of her dress, checking for anything hidden. She felt humiliated, confused, and scared. One woman in the crowd shouted, "That's enough. She's just a girl." The taller officer looked annoyed but didn't stop. He stepped back slightly, then said to his partner, "She's got something under there." "I don't," Aaliyah said quickly, her voice breaking. "It's just the lining of the dress," but they didn't listen. The officer leaned down slightly, tugging at the edge of her skirt as if to check underneath. At that exact moment, a man's voice shouted from across the street, "Stop! What are you doing?" The crowd turned. A woman had pulled out her phone and was calling someone loudly, saying, "You better come down here right now." The taller officer froze, realizing too late that several cameras were now pointed directly at him. The air grew thick with tension. Aaliyah's eyes filled with tears. She didn't know whether to run or stay still. Her whole body trembled as she whispered, "Why are you doing this?" Then came a call over the officers' radios. A voice said, "Unit 12, you're searching the wrong suspect. The shopkeeper identified another person running east." The taller officer looked stunned. The shorter one cursed under his breath. "Are you kidding me?" he muttered. The taller officer straightened his posture and cleared his throat. "All right, miss, you can go," he said stiffly. Aaliyah stared at him, unable to speak. "Go?" she repeated, her voice shaking. "After you just—" She couldn't even finish the sentence. The woman who had been recording stepped forward. "You better apologize to her," she said. "This is going online." The officers ignored her. They stepped back to their car, murmuring something to each other. The crowd was angry now. Voices rose, some shouting, some comforting Aaliyah. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" one elderly lady asked, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. Aaliyah nodded, though she wasn't. "I just want to go home," she whispered. She walked quickly down the street, her face hot with shame. The sound of people arguing faded behind her. Her vision blurred as tears finally fell. She turned the corner, leaned against a wall, and tried to catch her breath. She had always believed that if you were polite, respectful, and did nothing wrong, the police would protect you. But now she wasn't so sure. She took out her phone and saw that she had a few missed calls from her father. He was supposed to pick her up from the library later that day. Her fingers trembled as she called him back. When he answered, his voice was warm and familiar. "Hey, sweetheart. You okay?" Aaliyah tried to sound calm. "Yeah, I'm fine," she said softly. "Can you come get me? I want to go home." Her father heard something in her tone, that slight break that comes when someone's holding back tears. "Where are you?" he asked, his voice suddenly serious. "Near the convenience store," she said. "Elm Street. Stay where you are. I'm coming right now." 15 minutes later, his car pulled up. Aaliyah got in without a word. Her father looked at her face and saw the redness around her eyes. "What happened?" he asked gently. She shook her head. "I don't want to talk about it, but she didn't have to." Her phone started buzzing again. Messages, notifications, links. The video of the incident was already online. People were sharing it everywhere. Some were angry. Others were shocked. The caption read, "Police harass teen girl for no reason." Her father's phone buzzed next. He glanced at the screen and froze. Then he looked at her. "Aaliyah, that's you in the video, isn't it?" She nodded slowly, her lips trembling. "I didn't do anything wrong," she whispered. He reached out and took her hand. "I know," he said quietly. "I know you didn't." They drove in silence. But behind that silence was a storm. He didn't say it aloud, not yet. But as he replayed the video in his mind, something inside him shifted, a mix of pain, anger, and disbelief. By the time they reached home, the story had already spread. Neighbors were whispering, phones were lighting up, and social media was on fire. Aaliyah sat on her bed, hugging her knees. Her mother came in, sat beside her, and wrapped an arm around her. "You didn't deserve that," she said softly. Aaliyah's voice was small. "Why did they do that to me?" Her mother hesitated. "Sometimes people see what they want to see," she said. "And sometimes they don't see the person, just their own fear." Downstairs, her father stood by the window, his phone pressed to his ear. He was talking to someone at the police department. His voice was low but sharp. "Yes, I saw the video," he said. "You better believe we're going to talk about this. First thing Monday." He hung up and looked out into the night, his reflection dark against the glass. The town lights flickered in the distance. For years he had worked to make this town a better place, fairer, safer. And now the people who were supposed to protect his own daughter had treated her like a criminal. He turned back toward the stairs, listening to the faint sound of Aaliyah's voice upstairs. She was talking softly with her mother, trying to make sense of what had happened. He clenched his jaw and whispered to himself, "They don't know who they just humiliated." The quiet house seemed to hold its breath. Outside, the night wind carried the sound of distant traffic and the murmur of an awakening town. A town that would soon learn that the girl in the blue dress wasn't just another teenager on Elm Street. She was the mayor's daughter. That night was long for everyone in the Johnson house. The air inside felt heavy, filled with quiet words and restless thoughts. Aaliyah couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of the officers again. The crowd staring, the cold sound of one man's voice telling her to stand still. She turned over and looked at the clock glowing on her nightstand. It was almost midnight. Her phone kept buzzing on and off. Messages, tags, and links. Friends were texting her to ask if she was okay. Some messages were kind, some were just curious. She didn't want to read any of them. She turned her phone face down and stared at the ceiling. Downstairs, her parents were still awake. Her mother sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had already gone cold. Across from her, Aaliyah's father, Mayor Charles Johnson, was staring at his laptop screen. The video had now been shared thousands of times. The comments were endless, and people angry, shocked, and heartbroken. "This is all over the internet," her mother whispered. "Everyone's seen it." "I know," he said quietly. His tone was calm, but his eyes told another story. "I've already had 3 calls from reporters, and 1 from the police chief." Her mother looked at him carefully. "What did the chief say?" He sighed. "He said it was a misunderstanding. He said they didn't know who she was." Her mother's eyes filled with disbelief. "So it would have been fine if she wasn't our daughter?" Charles didn't answer. He rubbed his forehead, feeling the weight of every word. He was the mayor of the town, the man who was supposed to make sure everyone felt safe. But tonight his own child had been humiliated on the same streets he had promised to protect. Upstairs, Aaliyah finally got up and went to the window. The neighborhood looked quiet under the streetlights like nothing had happened. She watched a car drive by slowly, headlights sweeping across her front yard. For a moment she wished she could just disappear. Start over somewhere new where no one knew her name or what had happened. She heard a soft knock on her door. "It's me," her father said. She turned around and wiped her face quickly. "Come in." He stepped inside wearing the same shirt he had worn to work that morning. He looked tired, older somehow. He sat on the edge of her bed. For a while neither of them said anything. "I saw the video," he said finally. "I didn't do anything wrong," she whispered. "I know." Aaliyah looked down at her hands. "Everyone saw it, didn't they?" He nodded slowly. "Yes, but that's not your fault." She swallowed hard. "It feels like it is. I didn't even do anything, but it feels like I did." Her father leaned forward and took her hand. "You did nothing wrong. What happened to you shouldn't have happened to anyone." She hesitated before asking, "Are they going to get in trouble?" He didn't answer right away. "We'll see. The chief said there'll be an investigation. I'm going to make sure it's taken seriously." Aaliyah frowned. "But you're the mayor. Can't you just fire them?" He shook his head. "It doesn't work like that. If I interfere, people will say I'm using my position because you're my daughter. I have to handle this carefully." She looked away. "So they just get to keep working like nothing happened?" Her father's chest tightened at her words. He wanted to promise her justice, to say he'd fix everything, but he knew how the system worked. Change was never that simple. He squeezed her hand gently. "Listen to me. You're strong, Aaliyah. This isn't the end of your story. What they did says everything about them, not about you." Her eyes glistened again. "I didn't even want to go out today. I just wanted to get some books." He brushed her hair back softly. "You don't have to be afraid of walking outside because of this. You hear me?" She nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed it. When her father left the room, she lay back down and stared at the faint light from her phone screen. She finally picked it up and opened her messages. One video had already been shared by a local news page. The headline read, "Teen girl harassed by police in broad daylight." She scrolled through the comments, people expressing outrage, others defending the officers, a few saying cruel things she couldn't bear to read. She put the phone away again and cried quietly until she fell asleep. By morning, the story was everywhere. News vans appeared outside the mayor's house before sunrise. Reporters stood on the sidewalk holding microphones waiting for a statement. Inside, the Johnson family tried to go about their morning routine, but it was impossible to ignore the noise outside. Aaliyah stayed upstairs peeking through the blinds. She could see the cameras pointed toward her home. Her mother called her downstairs for breakfast, but she didn't feel hungry. "I don't want to go out there," Aaliyah said. "You don't have to," her mother replied softly. "Let your father handle it." A few minutes later, Charles stepped outside in a dark suit. The crowd of reporters immediately began shouting questions. "Mayor Johnson, what do you have to say about the incident involving your daughter? Do you believe this was a case of racial profiling? Are you planning to take action against the officers involved?" He raised a hand for quiet, his voice firm but calm. "I've seen the video, and like many of you, I'm deeply troubled by what I saw. My daughter did nothing wrong. No one should ever be treated that way, no matter who they are." The reporters kept shouting, but he continued. "The police department has promised a full investigation. I expect transparency and accountability. As mayor, I will make sure the truth comes out. As a father, I will make sure my daughter gets the respect she deserves." After a few minutes, he turned and went back inside, closing the door behind him. The rest of the day was a blur. Calls from city officials, community leaders, and family members came nonstop. Some offered support, others advice. The story had reached national news by the afternoon. Everyone wanted to know more about the girl in the blue dress. Meanwhile, in the police department, the atmosphere was tense. The two officers involved in the incident had been placed on leave while the investigation began. The chief called an emergency meeting, reminding everyone that the entire department was under scrutiny now. Back at home, Aaliyah sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone again. She saw people she didn't even know defending her online. A woman from another state had written, "This young lady deserves justice." Someone else had started a hashtag with her name. Her mother sat beside her. "You see that?" she said gently. People are standing with you, Aaliyah nodded slowly. Yeah, but it still happened. Her mother wrapped an arm around her. I know, baby. But sometimes when something terrible happens, it wakes people up. Maybe this will make things better for someone else. Aaliyah leaned against her and closed her eyes. For the first time since the incident, she felt a small spark of comfort. Later that evening, her father received a message from the police chief asking for a private meeting. He hesitated, then agreed. When he arrived, the chief greeted him stiffly and gestured toward a chair. Mr. Mayor, first let me say that we're all sorry for what happened. The chief began. The officers didn't realize who your daughter was. Charles stared at him for a long moment. That's the problem, Chief. It shouldn't matter who she was. You understand that, right? The chief nodded awkwardly. Of course. But the public reaction is intense. We're under a lot of pressure right now. Good, Charles said firmly. Maybe it's time the department feels some pressure. People have been talking about this for years, and now they have proof. I want a fair investigation, not a cover-up. Not excuses. The chief promised cooperation, but Charles could see the worry in his eyes. When he got home that night, Aaliyah was sitting at the dining table doodling quietly in her notebook. She looked up and asked, "How did it go?" He smiled faintly. "It's going to take time. But things are moving." She nodded, then hesitated. "Dad, yeah? Do you think people will ever forget this?" He thought for a moment before answering. "Maybe not. But maybe that's a good thing. Sometimes the things people can't forget are the ones that change the world." Aaliyah smiled weakly. "I just want people to know I didn't do anything wrong." "They will," he said. "You've already shown more courage than most adults ever do." She closed her notebook and leaned her head on her arms. For the first time, she believed him, even if only a little. Outside, the town was buzzing. Protesters had gathered near City Hall, holding signs, chanting for justice. People were angry, but they were also united. From her bedroom window, Aaliyah could see the glow of lights from the crowd in the distance. She didn't know what would happen next, but she felt something new stirring inside her. A quiet strength, a sense that maybe this wasn't just her story anymore. Downstairs, her father stood by the window again, watching the same lights. He knew this was just the beginning. The truth was out, and nothing about their quiet little town would ever be the same again. The next few days changed everything in the town. What started as one short video had become a national story. News vans lined the main street. Reporters spoke into cameras while showing the footage of the two officers and the girl in the blue dress. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone wanted to be heard. The town, once quiet and friendly, was now full of tension. People were talking everywhere, that in grocery stores, at bus stops, and in coffee shops. Some were angry at the police, some were defending them, and others just couldn't believe something like that had happened right in front of them. For Aaliyah, every day felt heavier than the one before. She stayed home most of the time, avoiding the outside world. Her social media was filled with messages, both kind and cruel. Some people called her brave, others called her a liar. She didn't know how to respond to any of it. Her parents tried to protect her, but it was impossible to keep the noise out. One morning, she went downstairs to find her father sitting at the table with his phone pressed to his ear. His voice was low, serious. "Yes, I understand," he said. "But this is not just about my family. This is about the entire community." He hung up and sighed, rubbing his temples. When he looked up, he saw Aaliyah standing there. "Another reporter?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "They want another statement. Everyone wants me to say something new, but I think people already know what needs to be said." Aaliyah sat down across from him. "What's going to happen to those officers?" He hesitated before answering. "The investigation is still going on. They've been suspended for now." She looked down. "Suspended? That doesn't sound like much." "I know," he said gently, "but this isn't over yet." Later that day, they could hear chanting outside. A group of protesters had gathered near City Hall, carrying signs that read, "Justice for Aaliyah and end racial bias now." The voices grew louder, echoing through the streets. Aaliyah watched from her window. She could see people of all ages, young students, older residents, and families, standing together. They weren't shouting in anger. They were speaking with passion and purpose. Her mother came into the room and stood beside her. "They're not just standing up for you," she said softly. "They're standing up for every person who's been treated unfairly." Aaliyah nodded, her throat tight. "I never wanted any of this. Her mother smiled sadly. I know, but sometimes life chooses us for a reason. That evening, her father was called to an emergency town meeting. The council chamber was packed. Some people held signs, others held phones, recording everything. The police chief sat at one end of the table, looking uneasy. When Mayor Johnson entered the room, the crowd went quiet. He took a deep breath before speaking. What happened to my daughter was wrong, he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. But this conversation isn't only about her. It's about the kind of town we want to be. If our people can't walk freely without fear, then we have failed them. The room filled with murmurs of agreement. He continued, we can't erase what happened, but we can make sure it doesn't happen again. I'm calling for a full review of police procedures, more training, and a community oversight board. The chief nodded stiffly. We support reform, but the public needs to understand our officers were following standard protocol. Someone in the crowd shouted, then your protocol is the problem. The room erupted in applause. The mayor raised a hand to calm them. Please, we need to fix this together, not tear each other apart. After the meeting ended, people surrounded him, some thanking him, others demanding more action. He answered as many as he could, promising that change would come. When he finally got home late that night, Aaliyah was waiting up for him. How did it go? She asked. He smiled faintly. Better than I expected. People are listening, she tilted her head. Are they listening because I'm your daughter or because it's the right thing to do? He paused, maybe both. But what matters is that they're finally listening. She nodded slowly. I want to do something too, she said. I don't want to just sit here. He looked at her curiously. What do you have in mind? I want to talk to the people at school. Maybe organize something. I don't know, a talk, a meeting, something where students can share their stories. Her father smiled proudly. That's a good idea. Start small. Change starts when people speak up. The next day, Aaliyah reached out to her school principal. Though the incident had made headlines, she wanted to return to her normal life as best she could. The principal, a kind woman with a calm voice, welcomed her idea. Within a week, the school held an open discussion called Voices of Change. Students gathered in the auditorium to talk about their experiences, fears, and hopes. Aaliyah stood at the front, nervous at first, but her voice grew stronger as she spoke. I never thought something like this would happen to me, she said, but now I know it can happen to anyone. What matters is what we do next, how we treat each other, how we speak up when we see something wrong. The students listened closely. Some even stood up and shared their own experiences, times they'd been unfairly judged or mistreated. The atmosphere was emotional but full of unity. When Aaliyah got home that day, she felt lighter. For the first time since the incident, she didn't feel powerless. Meanwhile, outside her school walls, the protest continued. The story had inspired other towns to speak up too. Across the state, people were demanding reforms, not just for Aaliyah, but for every young person who had faced injustice. The mayor spent long hours in meetings, drafting proposals and reviewing police policies. He knew some officers were angry, saying he was turning against them. Others quietly supported the changes, admitting that the department needed to rebuild trust. One afternoon, he received an anonymous letter in his office. It was from a retired officer who wrote, "What happened to your daughter opened my eyes. It should never have come to this. I hope you keep fighting for what's right." He folded the letter carefully and kept it in his desk. At home, things were still not easy. There were still nights when Aaliyah woke up from nightmares, remembering that moment on Elm Street, but she was learning to breathe through the fear. Her family surrounded her with love and patience. Her mother often told her, "You turned something ugly into something powerful." Sometimes Aaliyah would smile and say, "I'm trying." Then one evening, a new development hit the news. The police chief held a press conference announcing that both officers involved in the incident had officially resigned. The investigation had found that they had violated procedure. The reporter on TV said their names and mentioned the department's public apology to the Johnson family. When Aaliyah heard the news, she sat quietly for a long time. Her father watched her, unsure how she would feel. Finally, she said softly, "I didn't want anyone to lose their job. I just wanted them to see me as a person." Her father nodded. Sometimes that's the hardest lesson for people to learn. He reached over and squeezed her hand. but you taught this whole town something important. That matters more than anything. That night, the house felt different, calmer, but also stronger somehow. Aaliyah stood outside for a while, looking up at the stars. The air was cool and quiet. For the first time, she felt like she could breathe again. She still didn't know what the future would bring, but she knew she wanted to keep speaking out. She didn't want to be known only as the mayor's daughter. She wanted to be remembered as the girl who helped change her town. Back inside, her father was writing in his notebook. He was working on a proposal for new laws that would protect citizens during police interactions. When Aaliyah peeked over his shoulder, she noticed the title at the top, the Aaliyah Reform Plan. She smiled. "You named it after me?" He chuckled softly. "Well, you earned it." She sat beside him, resting her chin on her hand. "I think you're going to make a lot of people proud, Dad." He looked at her with warmth in his eyes. "No," he said. "You already did." Outside, the last of the protest signs had been taken down. The streets were quiet again, but the change had already begun. People talked differently now. There was more kindness in the air, more awareness in the eyes of strangers passing by. Aaliyah knew there would still be challenges, still be people who didn't understand, but that didn't scare her anymore. She had seen the worst of the system, and she had seen how strong people could become when they stood together. She went to bed that night with her heart a little lighter and her spirit a little braver, knowing this was only the beginning of a much bigger story. Days turned into weeks, and though the streets of the town were quieter now, something inside the community had changed forever. People spoke with a new kind of honesty. The town that once tried to avoid uncomfortable conversations was now learning to face them head-on. Inside the Johnson home, things were slowly settling down. Aaliyah was going back to school, and her father was spending longer hours at City Hall, pushing forward the reforms he had promised. But peace didn't come easily. Every step toward change seemed to bring a new challenge. One morning, while Aaliyah sat at the kitchen table eating breakfast, she heard her father on the phone in his study. His voice was low but tense. "I understand your concerns," he said, "but these changes aren't about politics. They're about doing what's right." There was a pause, then his voice hardened. "If some officers can't support accountability, maybe they shouldn't be officers at all." When he hung up, he came out and gave her a tired smile. "Another long day?" she asked. He chuckled softly. "You could say that. Not everyone likes change, even when it's for the better." Aaliyah stirred her cereal quietly. "They're blaming you, aren't they?" He sighed. "Some of them, yes. They think I'm turning against the police. But I'm not. I'm just standing up for fairness." She nodded. "That's what you always taught me to do." He smiled at her, proud but weary. "You're stronger than you realize, you know that?" She smiled back, though her heart felt heavy. She could tell the pressure was starting to wear on him. At City Hall, the atmosphere had grown tense. A few council members had begun to distance themselves from the mayor. Some whispered that he was too emotional or too personally involved. Others admired his courage but worried about the backlash. During one meeting, a councilman leaned forward and said, "Mr. Mayor, you have to think about your career. This issue has already divided the town. Maybe it's time to step back." Charles Johnson leaned his elbows on the table and looked the man straight in the eyes. "If standing up for justice cost me my career," he said calmly, "then maybe it wasn't worth having in the first place." The room went silent. That night, when he got home, he found his wife sitting on the couch watching a news report about him. The anchor was talking about the mayor's proposed police reform bill and the growing debate surrounding it. "People are talking," she said as he sat down beside her. "They always talk," he said with a tired smile. "I just hope they start listening too." She looked at him carefully. "Are you sure you can handle all this pressure?" He nodded. "I don't have a choice. Not after what happened." Meanwhile, Aaliyah had started volunteering with a youth group that focused on community unity. Every week they met to discuss how to bridge the gap between young people and local police. Some officers even joined the meetings to listen and answer questions. At first it was awkward. The first few meetings were filled with silence and careful words. But Aaliyah was patient. She spoke from the heart. "I'm not here to attack anyone," she said during one meeting. "I just want to understand how we can make things safer for everyone. For kids like me, for you, for all of us." Her honesty disarmed people. Slowly, walls began to break down. Officers started sharing their own experiences, the fear, the stress, and the mistakes they regretted. One officer, older and quiet, said softly, "What happened to you shouldn't have happened. I've got a daughter your age. I think about her every day now." Aaliyah nodded, her eyes glistening. "Thank you," she said simply. After that day, more people began to open up. It wasn't about blame anymore. It was about understanding. Back at City Hall, the mayor continued his fight. His proposal, which locals had started calling Aaliyah's Law, was nearing its final vote. It included new rules for searches, better training for officers, and a requirement that all interactions be recorded and reviewed by an independent board. The police union wasn't happy. They held their own press conference, claiming the mayor was surrendering to public pressure. When Aaliyah saw the news, she felt a sting of guilt. "They're mad because of me," she told her mother. Her mother shook her head. "No, they're mad because they don't like change. You're not the problem. You're the reason things will get better." Still, Aaliyah worried. She didn't like seeing her father attacked on television or in the papers. One morning, she overheard someone at school say, "Her dad's just using her story for politics." The words stayed with her all day. That evening, she told her father what she'd heard. He put his newspaper down and looked at her gently. "People will always say things, Aaliyah. When you stand up for something important, not everyone will clap for you. But that doesn't mean you're wrong." She smiled weakly. "You always know what to say?" He laughed softly. "That's because I've been in your shoes more times than you think." The night before the big vote, Charles stayed at his office late. He stared at the empty council chamber, the papers spread out in front of him. He thought about how far things had come, and how much further there still was to go. He thought about the girl in the blue dress on Elm Street, his daughter standing alone in fear. That memory still burned in his chest. But now it also fueled him. At home, Aaliyah couldn't sleep. She sat by her window watching the streetlights flicker. She thought about everything that had happened since that day. The fear, the pain, the protests, and now, the possibility of something good coming out of it all. The next morning, City Hall was packed again. Residents filled every seat, some holding signs of support, others skeptical but curious. Reporters lined the back wall. When the mayor entered, the room quieted. He took his seat and looked around, taking a deep breath before speaking. "I know some of you think this reform is about my family," he began, "but it's about our community. It's about making sure no one, not my daughter, not your child, not anyone, and has to live in fear of those sworn to protect them." The crowd murmured softly. He continued, his voice steady and clear. "This is not about punishment. It's about progress. We have to rebuild trust, and trust starts with accountability." When the time came to vote, every council member raised their hand one by one. The final count was close, 5 in favor, 4 against. The bill passed. The room erupted in applause. Some people cried. Others hugged. The mayor stood quietly for a moment, then exhaled deeply, the weight lifting from his shoulders. That evening, he returned home to find Aaliyah waiting on the porch. She had been refreshing the town's website all afternoon, waiting for the news. When she saw him step out of the car, she ran to him and hugged him tightly. "It passed?" she asked, though she already knew. He smiled, nodding. "It passed." She laughed and wiped her eyes. "You did it." He shook his head. "We did it." They sat on the porch for a while, watching the sun set over the quiet street. Neighbors waved as they passed, some stopping to say thank you. For once, the air felt calm again. Later that night, Aaliyah opened her journal and began to write. She wrote about everything, not just the pain, but the lessons she had learned. She wrote about forgiveness, about courage, and about hope. Her final line read, "Sometimes the worst moments in life can become the beginning of something beautiful." She closed the book and smiled softly. Downstairs, her father was already drafting his next project, a community mentorship program for teens and officers to build trust through real conversations. He called it Bridges. When Aaliyah came down to say goodnight, she saw the papers on his desk. "You never stop working, do you?" she teased. He grinned. "Not when there's still more good to be done." As she walked back upstairs, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. That night, the Johnson family sat together for dinner. There were no cameras, no reporters, no noise. Just laughter, gentle conversation, and the warmth of being together. Outside, the town lights glowed softly in the distance. The world wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But it was changing. Slowly, steadily, it was changing. And for the first time in a long time, that felt enough. Months passed, and life in the town began to shift in ways no one had expected. The new policies that had been implemented after the passing of the reform bill had a real impact on the community. There was a sense of change in the air, though it didn't come easily. People were still adjusting, still figuring out how to make the new systems work, but the changes were there. The tension between the police and the community started to loosen, and conversations that were once avoided were now happening regularly. Aaliyah continued to volunteer, working with both officers and students, creating spaces where they could talk about their differences and find common ground. Some of the officers who had been part of the first round of meetings with young people now came back voluntarily, eager to listen, share their own challenges, and be part of the healing process. The youth group that Aaliyah was a part of became a safe place for many students. They didn't just talk about police reform. They also discussed topics like trust, fear, and how to stand up for what's right without causing more harm. It was hard at first, especially when tensions flared or people argued. But slowly, everyone began to understand that change didn't always look the way you expected it. Sometimes it came in small moments of understanding, a handshake after an uncomfortable conversation, or the courage to speak out when something wasn't right. One afternoon, Aaliyah sat with her group of friends at the local coffee shop, feeling lighter than she had in a long time. The weeks of heavy news coverage had faded, and she could finally breathe without the weight of the world pressing down on her. "This is kind of crazy," one of her friends said, sipping her iced coffee. "Do you ever think about how much has changed since last year?" Aaliyah smiled, but there was still a hint of sadness in her eyes. "It's strange. Sometimes I think everything's going back to normal, but it's not. It's better. And I can live with that." Her friend nodded. "You did a good thing. You helped make this happen." Aaliyah shrugged, her usual humility surfacing. "I just stood up when I needed to. But it wasn't just me. It was everyone. We all pushed for it." Later that evening, her father came home earlier than usual. Aaliyah had gotten used to seeing him exhausted, coming home late at night, but tonight was different. He had a smile on his face, one she hadn't seen in a long time. "Well, what's this?" she asked. He sat down beside her on the couch. "It's official," he said, his voice filled with pride. "The first phase of the Bridges program is being implemented. It's happening for real. We're starting mentorships between officers and young people in schools all over the county." Her eyes lit up. "That's amazing." He laughed. "It's more than I expected. But people are starting to see it's not just about changing the system. It's about changing hearts." They spent the evening talking about his new project. He had spent months working on it, organizing training sessions, connecting with local leaders, and planning community events. It wasn't just a law or policy. It was a movement. A movement to show that both sides of the story, the police and the community, had to work together to make real progress. The next few weeks were busy. The Bridges program began with small workshops where officers and young people would meet in classrooms and talk about their experiences. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of anger and frustration, moments when neither side felt like they were being heard. But for the first time, people were talking to each other, really talking. Aaliyah watched as the program began to grow. She could see that it was making a difference, even if it was in small ways. The young people who had once felt like they were alone now had someone to talk to. The officers who had been hardened by the streets and their duties began to see the kids as more than just faces in a crowd. They started to see them as individuals with their own dreams and struggles. One evening, as Aaliyah sat in a community meeting with a group of teens and officers, she couldn't help but smile. She had seen some of these kids a few months ago, angry, confused, afraid. And now they were speaking up, asking questions, demanding change in their own way. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. The mayor's office received messages of support from across the state. Other towns wanted to replicate what had happened in their own communities. Some were skeptical, unsure if it would work, but more were hopeful, inspired by what had been achieved. Aaliyah's father was invited to speak at conferences, to share his story and the lessons he had learned from his own daughter. At first, he wasn't sure if he wanted to be in the spotlight, but Aaliyah encouraged him. "You've got this," she said. People need to hear what you have to say. So he spoke. And the more he spoke, the more people listened. But even with all the progress, there were still moments when the scars of the past seemed to resurface. One night, Aaliyah's father came home late, looking troubled. He didn't speak right away, but when Aaliyah asked him what was wrong, he sighed. "I met with the state police commissioner today," he said, his voice tense. "They're not happy with the changes. They think this whole program is a waste of time, that it's too soft." Aaliyah looked at him concerned. "Are you okay?" He rubbed his face. "I'm fine. It's just hard to face people who don't believe in what you're trying to do. They think reform is weak." Aaliyah sat beside him. "But you know what you're doing is right, right?" He nodded. "I know. But sometimes it feels like the harder I fight, the harder they push back." She put her hand on his. "You've come this far, Dad. You've done more than anyone could have imagined. You've changed this town." He smiled, the weight of his worry lightening just a little. "I guess you're right. We've made it this far together." Aaliyah's thoughts drifted to the day she had been stopped by the police, the day that had changed everything. It felt like a lifetime ago, but it still haunted her in moments of quiet. She had never imagined that one encounter would lead to so much change, but she also knew that it wasn't just the bad things that shaped a person's life. It was how they responded to them. For Aaliyah, that response had meant speaking out, standing up for herself, and ultimately standing up for others. She wasn't just the mayor's daughter anymore. She was a symbol of hope and change. A few months later, there was a big celebration at the town hall. It wasn't a victory celebration, it was something better. It was a moment to reflect on how far they had come, and to recognize everyone who had worked to make the town safer, fairer, and more united. Aaliyah's father stood at the podium, thanking the community for their hard work and support. He spoke about how the town had come together, how they had faced hard truths and difficult challenges, but had emerged stronger for it. After his speech, Aaliyah stood beside him, her heart full. It was a simple event with no grand speeches or fancy presentations. But the room was filled with people who had been part of this journey, people who had believed in something better and worked for it. As the evening went on, Aaliyah looked around the room, seeing familiar faces. The officers who had been there from the start, the students who had shared their stories, the parents who had supported the change. And she realized that it wasn't just the big reforms that mattered. It was the way everyone came together, the way they kept fighting for what was right, even when things seemed impossible. Her father, standing beside her, whispered, "We've made something beautiful here." Aaliyah smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "We have." And though the road ahead was still long, she knew one thing for sure. They had started something that could never be undone. A change had been made, and that change had started with one girl, one story, and one moment of courage that had sparked something much bigger. As the evening wore on and the room filled with laughter and conversation, Aaliyah finally understood what her father had meant. They had built more than just a program. They had built a community that cared for one another, that wanted to protect and support each other, and that was something that could never be taken away. It wasn't a perfect world, but it was a better one. And that, Aaliyah thought, was more than enough.